All right, here we're looking at section 1.5, and our big essential question is how can you measure and classify an angle? So our learning targets for today is first, we're going to be naming angles, then we're going to measure and classify those angles. Our third learning target is to identify congruent angles, and we'll talk about how we know they're congruent. Then we're going to use the angle addition postulate to find some measurements, and we're going to bisect some angles. So remember that when we say bisect, that means cut it exactly in half. So here's our first example. A lighthouse keeper measures the angles formed by the lighthouse at point M, and I can see here it's labeled with that capital M, and 3 different boats, and those boats are J, K, and L. We want to name 3 angles shown in the diagram. So first I know to name an angle I have to include the angle symbol, and then I have to have 3 different letters. The biggest thing when naming that angle is this middle letter has to be the vertex of the angle, and that's where it changes direction. Okay, so let's look at our picture here. So I see that I have an angle that goes from J to M to K. So I could have angle right? J, M, K. So let's find another angle I've got. So I see here I also can go from K, M, L. So I also have angle K, M, L. And you see in both of these, my M is my middle. And that's how we always name our angles. So then the third angle that I really see is I go from J through M through L. So this can be J, M, L. And that's how we always want to think of naming, and when we're given names, start at J, what point's the middle, and then I go down the other side. Okay, so now we have to name these and try them, a couple different ones. So here's our protractor postulate, and this I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because we've used protractors before. So this is really just talking about how to use a protractor. So I always put the center of my protractor right on that vertex, the middle point in my angle, and the line of my protractor along one of the rays. Then the other ray will tell me the measurement. So here I see this angle is greater than 90 degrees, so I know it's going to be this 140 degree angle. Okay, so now let's look at some different types of angles, and hopefully you've seen these before. So I have an acute angle, which is between 0 and 90. I have a right angle, and I know it's a right angle because of this little red square. If that's not there, I cannot assume that it's a right angle, but this is at exactly 90 degrees. I have an obtuse angle, which is greater than 90 degrees, and then I also have what we call a straight angle, and that straight angle measures exactly 180 degrees. Okay, so now we're going to find the measure of each of these angles and then classify them. So first I'm looking at angle GHK. So I'm looking at angle, let me get a different color, GHK, so that green one. So I can use my protractor, and I see I start at 0. I go past my 90, so I see I'm at 120, and it's going to be 125 degrees. And that's how we would write that. So this is between 90 and 180, so I know this is an obtuse angle. So now let's look at our next one, JHL. So here's JHL. So using my protractor, I see it's exactly 90 degrees, so that's a right angle. So our third one, we're going to find LHK. So LHK. Well, here's something a little different. We haven't seen this before. So now I can also use my protractor to determine this actual measurement. So I see I go from 90 to 125. So I can just subtract them. So I take 125 and subtract that 90, and I end up with 35. So this is the measure of that angle. And since it is less than 90 degrees, I can say that this is an acute angle. Okay, so now we've measured and we've classified these angles. So now go ahead and try a couple on your own. So now we're going to identify some congruent angles, and we can never assume that angles are congruent unless we're specifically told. So we have to identify those congruent angles. So the first thing I notice is I see several of them are measured in this quilt. So the other thing I notice is this angle G and angle B both have 1 hash mark through them. That tells me that angle G is congruent, and this is our symbol for congruent, to angle B, since they both have the same hash mark. So on that same note, I see that angle F here and angle D here have the same double hash marks. So that also tells me that angle F is congruent to angle D. So again, I use the information that I'm given here to kind of help me figure that out. So now my second part of the question. If the measure of angle ADC, so ADC, so this one right here is the one we're looking at, is 140 degrees, what is EFG? Well, here I said that they were congruent, so I know that the measure, that M in front just means measure, of EFG is equal to 140 degrees. So now try using this same quilt and see if you can show what we just talked about. Okay, so here's our angle addition postulate. This is one of our learning targets. Okay, so in words, easier words to understand, that if I have these two angles that are adjacent, right, they're touching each other, I can add them to make the bigger angle. Okay, so this blue angle, RST, is equal to the little pieces that it makes up. Okay, that's what that really means. So here's an example. So given that LK, the measure of angle LKN is 145 degrees, find the measure of LKM and the measure of MKN. Here we need to be very careful because often you're asked for the measure of the angle or the segment length or those things and not just to find X. So now let's label kind of what we know. So I know that LKN is 145 degrees. Well, I see that this is made up of two different pieces that I'm not sure of. But I can get there. Because of my angle addition postulate, I know I can take 2x plus 10 plus my 4x minus 3 equals 145. Because I can see that these two pieces, I can add them together and it gives me the whole thing. So I know I have 2x plus 10 plus 4x minus 3 equals 145. So now let's combine some like terms. So I have 6x, 10 minus 3 is 7, equals 145. So now I'm just solving for this x. So I have to undo that 7. So I subtract 7 first. So I have 6x equals 145 minus 7. So 15 minus 7 is 8, is 138. So now I want to divide by 6. Divide by 6. So I have x equals, 6 goes into 13 twice. With 1 left over, 6 goes into 18 3 times. So my x is 23. I'm not quite done yet because I was asked to find the entire measure of LKM, which is this piece, and MKN. So I want to find the measure of both of the smaller ones. So to do that, I just take what I found for x and I plug it back in. So I'm going to have 2 times my x, which was 23, plus 10, which gives me 2 times 23 is 46 plus 10 equals 56. So that is the measure of angle LKM is 56 degrees. So now there's two ways I can find this other MKN, this measure. I can either plug in my x again, or I can take my 145 minus 56 degrees. Either way will get me this measurement. So here are some for you to try. Look at this, especially I'm given that it's a straight angle. So what do I know about straight angles? How much do they measure? Those kinds of, think about those questions. Okay, so now we're going to deal with some angle bisectors. So ray QS bisects angle PQR and angle PQS equals 24 degrees. So first we have to draw a picture. So I know I'm dealing with angle PQR. PQR. And I don't have to draw it like beautifully because I know that I will eventually add measurements. So there we go. So PQR. And I know that QS bisects that. So there's my S. And so I'm going to label this, and this is another way I can label it, right? So I know that these two are the same. So PQS equals 24 degrees. So PQS equals 24 degrees. Find the measure of angle PQR. So find the measure of the entire thing. Well, since it's bisected, I know it's cut in half. So I also know that this would be 24 degrees. And when I add 24 plus 24, I end up with the measure of angle PQR is 48 degrees. And I just did that by adding the two pieces together. So here's another monitoring progress. Try it and see what you can do. Again, remember with bisecting and what we know about bisectors. So let's look back at our learning targets. So first we named angles, and remember to name those angles we always need 3 points, and the middle point is always going to be the vertex of that angle. Then we measured and classified them, and we identified some congruent angles just using the hashtags and how they are actually labeled. Then we looked at angle addition and seeing how we can add angles that are next to each other to equal the big one. And then we bisected those angles. So now that we've done all of these things, go ahead and work on that homework for this section.